Hello and welcome to the Progress Theory, where we discuss scientific principles for optimizing human performance. I am Dr. Phil Price, and on today's episode, we are joined by Hyrox athletes and the host of the Roxlyfe podcast, Greg Williams. Now, Hyrox is a functional fitness event which is gaining massively in popularity. It involves running and functional fitness stations and seems to be very popular with the hybrid and CrossFit and running communities. Greg, on his Roxlyfe podcast, has interviewed many of the elite athletes. So I wanted to speak to him to find out exactly what it takes to reach the elite level of Hyrox. As always, follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and check out all of our other episodes. Here is Greg Williams. Greg, thank you so much for coming on to the Progress Theory.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I've always wanted to speak to you regarding your opinions about Hyrox. Obviously, you run your own podcast regarding Hyrox. And I know we've said this before when we come, just before recording, we talked about usually people start a podcast because they have like a particular topic or a question they want to find as much about as possible. And then by going to all of these different athletes, coaches, the lot, you find out so much information, you're able to synthesize it. I was like, well, I've got to come speak to you because you've got so much experience speaking to all these people. I want to know as much as possible regarding Hyrox. I know, I was on your podcast, so I talked a little bit around, I guess, the science around hybrid training, but there's so much more about Hyrox I wanted to sort of touch on. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. I started the website really just as I thought Hyrox was going to grow. I could see it was going to grow. So I thought I'd write one or two articles about it, fairly basic articles about what it was. But then, I became fairly obsessed with the sport myself and trying to improve my performance. And then you delve into the data, and there's just so much data that Hyrox provides. And then you start talking to some of the athletes, and then that led to a podcast. And it's grown from there. So it's gone really well.
Tell me more about the podcast. I mean, obviously you talked a little bit about where the idea came from, but how's it all going?
Initially, it was a way to talk to some of the main athletes, I would say, some of the elite level athletes, find out about their training, their mindset, how they got into it, their tactics, that type of thing. And it's grown from there. So as the sport has grown, I think there's going to be 175,000 athletes competing in Hyrox next year. It's grown rapidly all over the globe. That obviously opens up the opportunity to speak to more and more people, and not necessarily just the elites of the sport, people with different backgrounds, different reasons for doing it. I don't know, example, like Tyler Saunders, who's done it with one leg, and then just people from all over the globe. And then I was saying to you before we were recording, Eve Muirhead has just got into it, and Jamie Peacock I spoke to recently, Gareth Timmins, who I think you've spoken to on your podcast as well. So people with really interesting backgrounds, finding out more about those backgrounds, and then also their thoughts around Hyrox.
Yeah, and you obviously compete in Hyrox a lot as well.
Yes, I do. Yeah, it's obviously very much a running-based event, not just running, but before finding Hyrox, I wasn't a runner at all. I used to be a sprinter when I was younger, so 200 meters was about as far as I went before that. But just for some reason, grew to love it. I think it's I was doing things like national fitness games and so on before finding Hyrox, but without truly knowing if I was improving at that. It would depend on the workouts that you'd had on the day or who you were competing against. But with Hyrox, the fact it's the same every time, and you get a time and you get all the data by station and all that sort of stuff, that really appealed to me.
Yeah. Well, for those that are listening that might not know too much about Hyrox, do you want to describe the event itself? Like you said, it's something where it's the same each time, so you can measure yourself with how well you did last time. So I think that, like you said, it was a driver for you. That's a driver for a lot of people why they like Hyrox. So yeah, do you want to give an overview of what Hyrox is?
Yeah, it's I guess you'd describe it as a functional fitness event. It's done indoors, 99% of the time at least, in a convention centre, and it consists of, you run a kilometre and then do a functional station, and you repeat that 8 times. So there's a total of 8 kilometres of running and 8 different stations, and those stations like 1 kilometre ski erg, 50 metre heavy sled push, 50 metre sled pull, 80 metres of burpee broad jumps, a kilometre row, 200 metre farmer carry, 100 metre lunges, and then 100 or 75 for men or women wall balls at the end. So, 8 kilometre running total. On average, that takes an hour and a half, but people like the elite of the sport do it in sub 60 minutes, and then some people can take 2 or 3 hours to do it. There's no time limit for completion. And it is like those exercises I just described they don't require a huge amount of skill at all. So it is very accessible for most people to be able to do with a basic level of fitness. And like there's no time limit for completion. So, in theory, you can walk the running section if you like.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a big driver for people, because I guess CrossFit kind of started off like that, but as that sport has evolved, it started to incorporate more and more different movements, each one being a bit more challenging because they want to progress the sport. So it's not me saying, CrossFit has become less accessible, but certainly people will see that and think, the amount of time and effort you've got to spend to become very proficient at some of the gymnastics movements. So I can't really do that. I can't afford the time to do that. What other options have I got to me? And Hyrox kind of fits that bill a little bit. And obviously you said National Fitness Games, there's a number of different ones that are popping up everywhere, but Hyrox seems to be the one that's leading that quite well at the moment. And more and more events are popping up in the UK, around Europe, and it's really cool to see just the expansion of the sport. Technically is really quick.
Yeah, it's really quick, and they're moving into more and more countries. It really is global now. It started in Germany and then was primarily focused in Europe, moved to the UK a couple of years ago. They're in the US. They're probably not growing as fast in the US. I don't feel as probably they want to or they intend to. But they, like this season, they've had events in Australia, Hong Kong. They've announced events in Taiwan. They've been to Poland. They've announced one in Mexico recently. So it really is global now. Just going back as well to the point you said about CrossFit and learning whatever, things like muscle ups and the time it takes to do that. I think Hyrox sits in that time zone where it's not like an Ironman, for example, where you have to do crazy amount of hours of training every week to have a good stab at it. You can do a lot of hours. Some of the elite athletes do, but I don't think you have to put in 20 plus hours a week to be able to do it. And so I think that's another thing that appeals to a lot of people as well.
Is there a particular station that you dislike the most? Or dislike's probably a strong word. One that you find, the most challenging?
I don't know. Personally, I wouldn't say I'm terrible at any of them or truly great at any of them. The burpee broad jumps is brutal. That really jacks your heart rate up quite a lot. So coming out of that and into the run and trying to keep your heart rate to a reasonable level is that's where that's midway in the race. That's where it really starts to feel quite grim. But you just got to suck it up at the end of the day, and it's part of the reason of doing it. If you wouldn't do it if it was easy, part of the reason is that it's hard. I think that's where it really starts to get hard at that point.
Yeah. I guess with that question, people often forget. Usually, it's where it's placed within the whole race will also determine if you like that or hate that particular part of the race. So, for example, my most challenging bit for me is getting off the row to the run, because I just feel like I've just had the wind completely taken out of me. Whereas if the row was the first event, replace that with the ski erg at the beginning, it might not have been that. It was just because it was at that point of the race where you're already under fatigue, and you're changing up exactly what you do. So that one's my particular Achilles heel.
Yeah, those ergs as well in particular. Even if you go 2 seconds per 500 meters too quick, that can really kill you for the rest of the race. It doesn't always give back what you put in. And I remember when I first did it as a double, so we split the kilometer 50-50. but I just blasted the 500 meters, and then trying to run after that was like so much harder than when I've done it as an individual and done a kilometre. It's like it's a very fine line that you've got to ride throughout the whole race, really, but especially on those ergs.
Well, it shows how important practice is at not only rowing, but knowing how good you are at running, but also transitioning between them. Because, like I said, if you just completely gun it, then you just don't have, or you don't have that ability to recover from getting off, allowing your partner to do the 500 meters and then going to the run. If you haven't recovered by that run, you're in trouble because you're losing a lot of time in the run. But yeah, like you said, if you'd slow down by like 5 seconds, for example, that means the detriment of your run would never be nowhere near as low. So yeah, it's a very tactical game, isn't it?
One of the things that the elites do very well compared to the average competitor is that side of things. Like they pace it very well. Their runs are very consistent throughout the race, and they know like where that line is and how far they can push on each section of the race. Yeah.
Before we discuss the elites, what's your training like for Hyrox?
My training is I put in a fair amount of hours to be fair for it. I mean, it depends at what point in the season we're talking. Like during the off season, there was a high percentage of easy zone 2 work and then like pure strength work than there probably is right now as we're in the thick of it. There is a fair amount of running training in that, and that can be slow, steady runs, like speed work, like interval work, and then some threshold work, as well as compromise work. So like bringing it together like a Hyrox type session where you're going from a run into a sled push and back again and so on. So there's a real mix of that. Personally, I don't do a huge amount of the long, slow runs, like because I'm not coming from a running background. I do have to be careful with the amount of volume that I do. So a lot of my running work, you might call like quality work. It probably is like more race pace, threshold, speed work, and then my slower stuff is generally bike, ski or row. From a strength side of things, like I don't do a huge amount of pure strength work in the season. Like there's probably like a maintenance volume, but then it's like working on the sleds, working on the lunges, on the wall balls, on the techniques and everything like that.
It's interesting what you're saying about your strength work. You probably do more pure strength towards like an off-season part, and now you're in the thick of it. You don't really do that so much. So I guess this strength work you're doing is very similar or specific to Hyrox itself, and definitely brings the question, like, how strong do you actually need to be good at Hyrox? You could put so much effort putting like a back squat from like 160 to like 180, but is that necessarily going to, is 160 already strong enough in terms of what the back squat is to transfer to the heavy stuff of the race? So it will be predominantly it will be the push, the sled push. Like, if you're on the elites and it's a 30 kg sandbag, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like you don't need to be super strong for that, although having a good amount of strength is good for that. And then it's just how well you can repeat that submaximal strength over time, isn't it? So, no, it's just interesting to see how you split it up, especially towards off-season and on your in-season stuff.
Yeah, and that's exactly it, what you were saying about strength. You have to be strong enough. Like, you have to be strong enough to move those sleds. Like they're the heaviest part of it. But once you are strong enough, then it comes down to like you say, repeating it and like get more into muscular endurance. And you could argue like your muscular endurance or strength endurance is impacted by your maximal strength, but like working really at that top end sort of strength, I don't get the impression. Like I've surveyed the elites, like spoken to a lot of the elites, they're very good runners. They're not the strongest guys you're ever going to meet by any means, and so like they're strong enough to get it done, but they're not crazy strong.
Yeah. What was your transition from going from a 200 meter runner to, I guess, a longer runner, because you're doing intervals of 1 kilometer? But how did you find that transition? Because I think when people think about the determinants of Hyrox performance, people seem to forget half of it is running. So you need to be a good runner to be good at Hyrox. So yeah, how did you find that transition, I guess, from going from much more of an explosive athlete to something where the event lasts over an hour, for example?
It's just a case of building the volume gradually and probably more gradually than you really want to. Like you see people going like an amazing pace and you want to be at that level, but it is just being careful with it, I think. And like I think there's a huge amount in anything really to be said for consistency and sticking with it. And if you can avoid injury and just like consistently train and chip away at things over time, that becomes very beneficial. Like I said before, like a lot of my work is like the quality work. Like I don't go for too many long runs. It really a lot of my work like is the speed work, the threshold work, the compromise work. And that's not to say I don't do any of it, but I do have to be careful. Like I start to feel it in my Achilles and my hip and all that sort of stuff if I do too much. And I'm 82 kilograms, so I'm not huge, but I'm not the smallest guy either. So I think that plays a part. So yeah, that's really just how I've approached it. Selecting the type of running that I do and then just building the volume gradually.
Yeah, people forget that, when you're a heavier athlete, every time you make contact with the ground when you're running, you're like pounding against the ground. So if you're doing that for long periods of time, that can be quite difficult. Like I know we talk a lot about when it comes to hybrid training, utilize things like the bike where you're off your feet, where you can try and get more of that zone 2 work, but you're not hammering yourself to the point where it could be detrimental to you.
It's quite interesting as well. A few people I've spoken to, I've known have been out injured for a long period of time, unable to run, and then come back and still performed very well. And one example, like David McGeeder, who was the North American champion last year. I know, like for a long time, like throughout this whole off season, he wasn't able to run, but he'd done a ton on the ergs, a ton on the air bike, and then came back and like pretty much won the North American Championship. So it is quite interesting that it can be done. And like when you are injured and you can't run, it like feels like the worst thing in the world because you just feel like you're losing all your fitness and all your gains. But the people I've spoken to, I don't get that impression that happens if you can train around it.
Yeah. But that leads quite nicely into maybe what do you think it takes to compete with the elite level? So I'm not just thinking you've got the open and the sort of pro race, but someone like a Hunter McIntyre, for example, Ryan Kent, all of those athletes, what type of qualities do you think they have which enables them to compete at the top of this technically new sport?
There's a number of things. Like they are all good runners, very good runners, taking into account their strength levels. Now, Hunter is maybe a bit of an outlier in reality. Like he's a phenomenal athlete. And you could say, well, you've got to be that fast and that strong to compete at the elite level. But there are others that compete at that level that aren't as strong as him. But they are all very good runners. So most of them will have in the elite 15, would have a sub 17 5K on the men's side, sub 19 on the women's. And that scales up like through the 10K and half marathon numbers. That's like the primary thing, really. Like from a performance perspective, their squat and deadlift numbers. Let's have a look. I think they're around. So on the guys, for a 3-rep max squats, they probably average 130 kilograms, and on the deadlift, about 165 kilograms. So, strong but not crazy strong. And there was a guy that did very well at the weekend in Chicago in the elite race that he can barely squat. He told me like 80 kilograms, and he finished 5th in that race, or 4th, I think it was. But he comes from like an Ironman background, so he's got the engine. He's a very good runner. He's strong enough to move everything. So yeah, some strength, but not crazy levels of strength. And then there's like the muscular endurance side of things. So one of the slowest runners on the women's side is Miriam von Roa. She's comes from a CrossFit background. I think she's around like the 20-minute 5K sort of mark. So, fairly solid runner, but her muscular endurance is phenomenal. So like she can do like 100-meter lunges in a crazy time. She does the 100 wall balls at the end in like 2 minutes 50 unbroken, no problem. She's done the like carrying CrossFit workout, 150 wall balls. I think she's done that in 4:10. She told me her 1 rep back squat is 130 kilograms, but in training she's done 25 reps for 100 kilograms and 69 reps for 85. And she still is able to compete despite like essentially being the slowest runner in that elite field because of that muscular endurance. So she makes up the time on the stations, and they're all pretty good on the ergs as well. So like most of the guys will be like sub 7 at least for the 2K on the row and the ski, for example.
No, that's really cool and interesting numbers to hear about, like in terms of, I guess they're performance metrics, which everyone can kind of relate to, and they're very similar to the parts of the event that actually happens in Hyrox. Really interesting to see. I guess the thing that stood out to me was regarding that female athlete, so I can't remember the name, regarding like, oh, well, here's her max squat, but take 30 kilograms off her, and then all of a sudden she's like doing huge sets with that. I think that's a really key thing to start looking at. I know that's something we wanted to start looking at in terms of, I guess, the scientific background to that, because say you've got like 100% your 1RM, and then, okay, let's find 90% of that, do as many reps as you can, 80% of that, do as many reps as you can. And okay, those that can do higher reps at like high loads, what kind of muscular qualities do they have, which enables them to do high reps at high loads, because ultimately that's probably what's going to be more important than a 1 rep max, if you know what I mean. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I've surveyed the elites. They say, I know these results, and if you look at their pure run times and their like 3 rep max squats, deadlift, military press, and their erg times, you can't just look at those in isolation and be able to predict the results of the race. Like it might, it gives you some correlation, but it's certainly not like predictive by any means. Like there's other factors that play a part, and that muscular endurance is a factor. I think there's numerous mindset factors that play a part, and I can talk about those as well if you like. And then there's also the compromised side of things. So it's fine. What if you can run 5K in sub 17 minutes? That's fine. There's a lot of people doing Hyrox that can do a sub 17 5K, but they can't get close to what those elite guys are doing in a Hyrox. And so, how fast are they when they're compromised once they've pushed that sled or done 100 meters of lunges or something like that, or even come off the ski erg, like the first station they've done a 1 kilometer ski erg. We sort of talked about this when you come on my podcast, that just the movement of the blood around the body, how much is that compromising them? And I think there's some people that just don't deal with that very well, and the elites of the sport do. And that some of that can come down to like strength, obviously. If you're very strong and you push a sled, it compromises you less than a weaker person. But I don't think that's like the only factor.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because I always try and see it as like affordances. So every athlete is going to have certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and the better athletes are going to be the ones that can utilize their strengths more effectively to do the performance than the others. So sometimes it's not always like, okay, test this, and this. Okay, now I can predict exactly where you're going to be. It's not like cycling where you probably be able to predict performance a little bit better than that. Obviously there's other factors, but it's a bit easier in a single sport like cycling. But those that tend to do better, maybe this links into what you were saying regarding mindset, because they are able to utilize their strengths better and in a more efficient way to do certain tasks within the sport. So always an interesting way of just like, you can almost like, okay, here we've got 5 athletes, they're different. What exactly makes them good at Hyrox? So there's always a really interesting discussion there. From discussing with the elites, you're saying about mindset. What kind of separates them from a mindset perspective to those that might not have reached that top level, do you think?
Yeah, there's a few things I've thought about on this side. That like Hyrox is your red line or threshold for an hour, say, and it's uncomfortable, right? It's like you feel grim for an hour, and I think like those elites are happier sitting in that place than some other people are. I think like you can back off a touch and convince yourself you're still working hard and it still feels bad. But I think they're more comfortable being uncomfortable for that period of time. I think that's a big factor for some people. I think they are very competitive. When the gun goes off, they are like they'll do anything to win at that point. And the personalities are very different. Even World Championship, the World Champions, like Hunter McIntyre versus Lauren Weeks, like 100% like different type of people. You can imagine Hunter would, like he said, like, I was listening to a podcast that he did with Lauren the other day, and he was just like, I just imagine I want to kill people when I'm competing against them. And she was like, me and you are just such different people, you know, because like she's not like that at all. But I do think when the gun goes off and they're in that race, they will do anything to win. And I talked about this with another one of the guys, Dylan Scott, and he said, yeah, like that is what we're like. And he said, you can bet if you like phoned any one of them now, they're thinking about Hyrox. Like that is what they think about 24/7. I think something I've noticed is that they do hard things like at the drop of a hat. So one example, like the UK's fastest guy is Graham Halliday, and he comes from a bodybuilding background. He like didn't do much running before, but he told me he'd done a 100-kilometre run. Someone asked him if they wanted to do a 100-kilometre run with 4 to 6 weeks' notice. He was just like, yeah, and like did it. Broke a few bones in his feet doing it. And I think I know there's a lot of people, this sort of mentality, it's not only the elites, but they will do stuff like that without really like thinking, oh no, I'm not ready. Like they'll just go ahead and do it. So I think there's something there, like you see them that they just go and do a marathon in the off season, like Hunter did an Ironman in the off season. That type of thing, they're very happy to go and do. Yeah, there's a few things like that I've noticed with them.
Yeah. I can definitely resonate with that. Not from a point of like, that is exactly me, but almost from a point that I know at times where, shall I push? No, I think too much, or maybe about this. And because I'm thinking too much, rather than, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll push myself to that limit. I then probably don't get to that limit where you're literally trying to like, I'm doing whatever I can to beat the next person, because I'm so focused on all the minutiae of what I need to do. I then don't push as hard as I potentially could be. There's so many times I've reached the end of a race and I've realized, like, hold off here because you don't want to blow up later. Hold off here, you don't want to blow up later. You get to the end, you're like, oh, I never really blew up. And I always think it's like my mindset affects my perception of where that red line is. Now, obviously, you don't want to go too far, but my perception stops me getting too near it, and then it kind of limits my performance in that sense.
Yeah, funny enough, I was talking with Eve Muirhead about this a couple of days ago, where she was in her final Olympics where she won the gold. She said like one big difference for her was that like she wasn't afraid to lose anymore, and she was willing to start taking risks in the sport, and it resonated. I spoke to Chris Hinshaw in Chicago, who spoke to like some of the athletes before the race, and he said like, you've got to take risks. And I talk all the time about pacing in Hyrox. You can't go out too hot, and you've almost got to pace almost like every station, actually. Like it's only the wall balls where you really go full send, because you've got to be able to do the other things. But there is that also, you've got to take some risks, and you've got to push yourself. And like you said, you can convince yourself you're pushing yourself hard, but like not going quite to as hard as you can. And then finishing the race and being like, I had something left in the tank there. Yeah. And some of that comes from like just race practice and being willing to fail.
Do you think it's something that can be easily taught? I mean, I know there's a lot of sports psychologists that try and encourage, I guess, risk taking. A lot of people get really quite apprehensive, especially when there's a lot of sporting pressure on them. And then you get some athletes that pressure is a privilege. I don't care. I'm going for it, taking that risk. And they just seem to have that ability to do it. Do you think it's, I guess, from a Hyrox perspective, it's something that can be taught or practiced?
I think it can be practiced. I mean, obviously everyone is different, and it can come down to race experience. Like Hyrox, there are a lot of races now that you can go and do, but if you're just in a country where there's only one or two races, it's not like it. I come from a football background, and like you play football every week, and there's a match every week. There's not a Hyrox race every week, so you're always a little bit hesitant to risk too much in like when it comes around. But I think it can be taught or practiced, and I think some of it is just like not tying yourself or your happiness to the outcome or the final time or your position, which is very, very easy to do in Hyrox, because like you've got your time that you want to beat, and you can compare it against everyone on the day, and you can compare it against everyone ever across the globe that's ever done a Hyrox. But if you don't tie your happiness or your self-worth or whatever to that outcome, and you just say, like, did I execute what in the way I wanted to execute, then yeah, I think it can be done.
Say you were coaching an athlete that really wanted to reach the podium. Maybe the last time they realised they came 10th. Normally, say you got men's pro, there might have been 100 athletes that are there. I want to reach the podium, but I reached 10th. What kind of things do you think that person in their training should focus on to, I guess, this is quite a broad general question, but from your conversations with elite athletes, those that, are at the pinnacle of Hyrox, what do you think they are doing that might be slightly different that would enable someone just to reach that next step and, hit the top ends of performance for Hyrox?
I mean, I guess if they'd finished 10th, you'd first be able to look at their race data and see, like, was there a particular station they performed poorly on or relatively poorly, because you can compare it against everyone else in the race. And obviously we all have our own strengths and weaknesses, but was there anything there that was a factor? Often it's the running, because that's essentially 50% of the race. So that is a major factor. And like from a running perspective, how well did you pace it? Was your running consistent? Like one of the things that we certainly see with the elites is that each run time is very consistent throughout the whole race, as opposed to starting out at a crazy pace and then deteriorating. So that's like maybe some of the basic stuff that you can certainly look at, and then like working on, if it is something like the sled pull or wall ball or the burpees, for example, that can be not just pure fitness, but also like technique. There's a technique to those that can save you a huge amount of time. I guess the next step, like if it was just pure training and fitness, it would depend on where that was that they were falling down and what they've been doing in their training previously. And maybe also where they are in the season and how they've structured their season. I should have mentioned this before when we were talking about the elites, but I think some people structure their year, this is the impression I get, structure their year more effectively than some other athletes. So if you look at Hunter McIntyre, he's a very experienced athlete. He's been doing this type of thing for years. And he's done a doubles so far, but we're in November now, and he's not going to race his first race of the season until 2 weeks' time, basically, with a view to winning the World Championships in June, at the start of June. There's some other athletes that have already raced 3, 4, 5 times, chasing a time, chasing qualification. They've not had that nice off season. They're not necessarily like peaking effectively. I think there's a level of maturity in someone like Hunter and some of the other experienced athletes that with how they structure their season. So I think that's a factor as well. Going back to the example athlete we were talking about, so that it would depend where they are in their season as well as to what we started chasing. If they'd been doing a huge amount of zone 2 work and strength work, like I said, sort of from the off season, moving more into that sort of threshold and race pace type work and compromise work, and more like Hyrox workouts without doing a Hyrox every training session, I think would be important as well.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point regarding peaking, because I've spoken to a lot of coaches who argue that to truly peak, you only have the capacity to be able to do that like 2 to 3 times a year. And so that doesn't mean that you don't necessarily have to not compete, but you have to take into account that you're not going to be at 100%, or you should be focused on giving 100% every time. Maybe you've got, say you did, I don't know, 6 Hyrox events in a year, and you wanted to peak around number 3 and number 6. So you've got like 1 and 2 are kind of acting as like training sessions. So you can try new things, push in different areas. And that will enable you to find out as much more about your own physical performance to lead you to truly peak. But if you try to push yourself at 100% at all 6 of them, then you're lacking your ability to, I guess, recover truly, or at least recover so you can put a good amount of training in between each one to enable you to peak. So yeah, it's an interesting to hear like the athletes at the elite level have different strategies, and Hunter is clearly peaking for one particular title, and you think that's one of the best strategies to do.
Personally, yeah, it's the nature of the beast in some ways. There's 4, I won't go into too much detail, but there's 4 major races that these elites can race at, and they will use those to try and qualify for the elite race at the World Championships in June. Hunter does still have to qualify, but he knows he's one of the best. He knows he can probably run one race and qualify. Whereas there's others that are trying to get a time in a regular race to qualify for those majors, to then try and qualify for the World Championships through those majors. So, like, Hunter's can be fairly relaxed. He's racing, when we record this, in 2 weeks' time in Stockholm. He's probably fairly confident he's going to finish in the top 3 in that race and then qualify for the World Championships. But there's others that are just like chasing that time, and they're going to go and race in Barcelona this weekend, and they race the other weekend somewhere else and try and get that time to. And I just, they're constantly pushing themselves without truly peaking for one race. So
imagine all the travel. That's going to be like the fatigue from that is going to really add up, and you start to realize just how much indirect factors will play into it as well. So, really choose when you're going to peak. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about the elites, but say if you're working with someone that's new to Hyrox, from like a beginner point of view, where would you recommend? What recommendations would you have for someone that's starting off? Would you push them towards, just get really good at running, or are there other things you think that to get really involved with the sport of Hyrox, people should try certain things before they start thinking about taking it to the next level?
I think it probably depends on their background. If they come from a running background and they're particularly weak and they struggle to move the sleds, or do an erg or do a wall ball, then their focus needs to go to somewhere different, to a crossfitter, for example, that maybe hasn't done so much running but is very good on the stations. So it's identifying like what background and that person comes from, and what they need to work on, and then you can probably if it's a runner, they can probably go to a fairly basic maintenance running plan, and spend some time, building up the strength and working on the exercises. So I think it probably depends on their background, really. But certainly, like, running is the critical element for most people in the race. Compromise running, I should say. So getting to a point where they're comfortable with that over that sort of time domain as well is the most important thing. I know that's not like the best answer, but it is very much dependent on the person.
I think it's a great answer. I guess it's understanding where your strengths lie and trying to bring up your weaknesses in a way, so that your running and the strength station components are brought up to a similar level. I know we talked about strengths and utilizing the strengths, but getting both components to a good moderate ability is probably pretty important. And I guess just enjoying it is the main thing. Just really, really enjoy training for the sport and the sport itself.
Yeah. And there is a huge amount to be said for experience and pacing properly, like all that sort of stuff. Most people vastly overestimate their ability in a race. Like, probably take whatever you think you're going to do and add 10 minutes onto it, I would say, for most people doing a Hyrox. But some of that you can work out in training if you do it properly, and if you work with someone that's actually been to a Hyrox before and know how the sleds feel and understand things like the rock zone and all that sort of stuff that's going on. Experience counts for a lot. So like doing some sims and like understanding the pacing and like not kidding yourself that because you can do a 20-minute 5K, that don't mean that you're going to be able to run individual kilometres at 4 minutes per kilometre or anything like that, because you'll be shocked. So.
Is that where everyone mainly overestimates, is that first run? Because I'll admit that I will look at my own results and then you'll see like the people around you, how they've done. And usually there's like their first kilometre is done in like, I don't know, 3 minutes 50 or 4 minutes 10. And then it comes to like later on, 4 minutes 40, 5 minutes 10, 5 minutes 50. It just drops. And it almost starts with that first kilometre. And I just feel like that must be where people, either they get like so excited by the atmosphere and stuff and everyone's bezzing for it. You don't want to be left behind, so you just go for it. Or people completely overestimate their ability to run between each of the stations. I do wonder which one most people do. I do wonder maybe it's the first one, just because it is a good environment, isn't it? It does get you hyped up and you do feel really good. Like you feel like you're bouncing along that first kilometre. Oh, I'm doing all right there. And then you get to the third kilometre and you're like dragging your feet.
Yeah. And they do hype it up. Like you're in that tunnel and they're playing the music and everyone goes out hot. So you sort of like end up sticking with them. But yeah, if you can just reel yourself in, you'll benefit quite a lot. Yeah. And I personally get quite geeky on this. Like I will look at the floor plan. I will work it, because sometimes the first run is slightly shorter or longer. So I'll work out how quickly I want to do that run. And how, like, if it's 2.5 laps, for example, and I know I want to run, let's say 4:30 pace, I will know how quickly I want to do a lap. So I'm constantly looking at my watch and saying, right, that's whatever that works out to be, like 2 minutes. I'll be timing that, and I can't imagine leaving it to chance. I can't imagine trying to do it without my watch or timing my laps or anything like that, because I think you can easily get caught up in it all.
Where do you think the sport's going to go? Like, it's still new, but it's, there's more events per year. Now they seem to be doing double days. So, London was Saturday, Sunday, whereas before it was just Saturday. So clearly there's the demand for more people taking part. So they've had to spread it over 2 days. The times keep getting broken. Like, what's the world record time? Let's say men's pro and women's pro.
54 something on the men's side and 58 on the women's side.
That's absolutely insane. That's insane. So, where do you think the sport will go, either from a performance perspective or from a business perspective?
From a business perspective, it seemingly is continuing to grow rapidly, and I think that's deliberate. I don't know how they're doing profit-wise, but I think they're really trying to make an imprint in as many countries as possible, because when someone has done one, it is quite addictive. Like, you get a time and then you want to beat it and you tell your friends about it and you post about it on social media and more people find out about it. And it's like grown very quickly for that reason in the UK, especially. The events are crazy. And I think that's why they're going into, all these countries, Mexico and Taiwan and Korea, and like they've been to Australia, because I think they're trying to get that footprint, if you like. Because there could be like competitors that set up. It's like, it is just a functional fitness competition at the end of the day, but they seem to be executing it very well. So I think I can see it continuing to grow. Certainly, I personally think it can become as big or bigger than CrossFit because it is so accessible and because people, just get that time that they want to beat. From an elite side of things, I think they really are starting to try and push that now. There is prize money this year. Not crazy prize money, but there was like the major race in Chicago most recently. There was like $6,000 for the winner of that, and that there was prize money for all 15 of them to a certain extent. Plus, there'll be more at the World Championships. Plus, I think they're really trying to encourage those athletes to. They want them to become professional. They want them to be able to get their own sponsorship. And they're facilitating that through doing quite high quality, in theory, broadcasts and live streams of those elite races, and also the way that the season is structured and how to qualify for those major races and so on is quite hard to break into. So once you're in it and you perform, you've got a place. Like there's 7 that have auto qualified for the remaining races of the season, and being able to go to a sponsor and say, I will be in all these races and I've qualified for the World Championships and it's going to be live streamed. What's that worth to you, and are you willing to sponsor me? So I think they're trying to facilitate that side of things, because previously it was always done on who had the 15 fastest times from any race, and it was constantly changing. Like you never really knew from one weekend to the next who was going to be in the top 15. And I think of it as like, if you compare it to Formula One, for example, if Sergio Perez went to a sponsor and said, I know I'm in all the races for this Formula One season, as opposed to if someone goes quicker than me next week, I'm not going to be in it. That's a big difference in what they're going to get sponsored. So they are trying to encourage the professionalisation of the sport, certainly. I can see it continuing to grow, certainly. As for performances, it's hard to say. Like they're constantly improving. The level of competition and the depth of the field is certainly increasing as well. Like Hunter McIntyre on the men's side is the standout performer, but 2 guys have gone very close to him recently. Hunter thinks he can get to a 52 this season. Like whether he does or not remains to be seen. But it's like when you actually look at all the elements of the race and how quickly, there's only so quickly someone can do 100 wall balls, for example, or 100 lunges, and it's hard to see it getting smashed like his time, but records are continuing to fall. So yeah, it's certainly be interesting to see.
No, definitely. I did wonder if performance will start reaching some form of physical ceiling, but I think there's been a number of times in history where we've thought, the human body is only capable of certain things, and all of a sudden someone breaks it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 10 years. I know we keep comparing it to CrossFit, but I'm sure I reflected like 4 or 5 years ago. I thought, the WODs that they're programming, they must be reaching some level of, the weights that they're choosing within these Metcons. It must be reaching some kind of limit, but then it continues to progress. So, I mean, I'd love to predict how far that's going to happen, but I don't think anyone truly knows. So it'll be still really cool to see where Hyrox goes. And even if it does reach some kind of ceiling, people still want to compete to see how close they can get to that ceiling. We've got Bolt with his 9.58 100 meters. Doesn't mean that people are stopping sprinting because I can't reach that. No point. It's still a huge global event every 4 years, isn't it? And obviously you've got the Diamond League every year as well. So, nothing to say that Hyrox won't be similar. People want to see how close they can get to the record. So, yeah.
And that's why they have races. Yeah, that's why they have races against each other as well. So it's not just about like getting the time, like they're racing against each other, and also like going back to the professionalisation and the money coming in. You're going to attract more and more athletes potentially from other sports that want to come and do it. So there's Michaela Norman on the women's side is one of the top 3 women really in the sport. She's been to the CrossFit Games as a team. she was a very good level CrossFitter, but she's come over to Hyrox. Like, that's her primary focus now, and I wonder if you'll see more and more of that over time as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to see how Hyrox grows, and I've obviously competed recently in mixed doubles, and we're already keen to try and see if we can beat our time again. So, you get that bug, don't you? You really do get that bug with these types of events. But Greg, mate, that was amazing. Thank you so much. How can people get in contact if they have one, they want to listen to your podcast, or two, if they just want to get involved with Hyrox as a sport in general?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. So my podcast is the Roxlyfe podcast. That's Roxlyfe. I've got a website as well, roxlyfe.com, and I'm on Instagram at the Roxlyfe. So they're the main places you can find me. We've got lots of articles, podcasts, videos on YouTube as well. We do coaching. We've got a 12-week coaching plan, all kinds of things from that perspective. And you can find out more about Hyrox from there, really, as well as Hyrox have got multiple websites depending on what country you're in, but hyrox.com will essentially get you there.
Yeah. No, brilliant. I definitely recommend anyone that's interested in Hyrox to check all of that out. And we'll have that all in the show notes. And I've definitely listened to a few episodes myself, and they're really good and really informative. So please check that out. And I was reading one of your articles not too long ago regarding organisation of training within a day. Really good stuff. So please, everyone listening, check that out.
Your interview on my podcast, it's one of the most popular. People still message me and say, people often message me and say, that's one of the best podcasts I've ever heard. And there's 3 or 4, maybe 5 podcasts that people say, like, I've listened to that multiple times because there's so much gold in it, and yours is one of those. So yeah.
Oh, thank you very much.
Listen to that.
I'm glad people aren't bored of hearing me speak. So thank you. No, that's brilliant. But it's great news to hear. That made me very happy on this Friday afternoon. So, brilliant. Anyway, Greg, hopefully we'll be able to catch you at a Hyrox event in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, likewise.